The Structural Realignment Thesis. Why shooting down a $20,000 drone with a $2 million missile is a compensating mechanism. Summary statement. When tightly coupled systems adapt at fundamentally different rates or shift into completely different state spaces, the legacy architecture does not immediately collapse. Instead, it generates increasingly complex, increasingly expensive compensating mechanisms designed to force an evolving reality back into an obsolete model. Systemic crisis occurs when the maintenance overhead of these patches consumes the system's remaining operational capacity. True resolution cannot be achieved by pushing legacy controls harder, nor by gathering higher resolution measurements along obsolete dimensions. Instead, the system requires a structural realignment that resets the control architecture so it once again matches the underlying physics of reality. Section 1. Introduction and the core invariant. Systemic breakdowns in economics, governance, technology, and military strategy are rarely independent events. Modern analysis tends to isolate each failure: sovereign debt, regulatory stagnation, supply chain fragility, military doctrine becoming obsolete. Each is usually treated as a separate problem governed by its own rules. This thesis proposes something different. It suggests that these apparently unrelated failures are all manifestations of the same underlying systems principle. The core invariant is this: when two tightly coupled functions evolve at materially different rates, they progressively lose structural alignment. Imagine a simple diagram. Across the top is operational reality. It continues evolving rapidly. Beneath it sits the control architecture. It adapts much more slowly. Between the two, an alignment gap steadily grows. That growing gap accumulates friction and complexity. The faster reality evolves relative to the control system, the larger the gap becomes. A control architecture does not immediately fail when it loses alignment with reality. Instead, it attempts to bridge the widening gap. It introduces translation layers, regulatory overrides, financial leverage, administrative workarounds. These secondary structures are what this thesis calls compensating mechanisms. Compensating mechanisms create the illusion of stability. They allow institutions to continue functioning. They create the appearance of tactical success. But underneath that appearance, they drive long-term structural bankruptcy. The system gradually spends more and more energy maintaining obsolete assumptions than performing its original purpose. When collapse eventually arrives, it is not primarily caused by an external shock. It is caused by internal overhead consuming the system itself. Section 2. The taxonomy of system decoupling. Structural misalignment appears in three distinct forms. Imagine a simple table with 3 rows. The first row represents temporal mismatch. This is a mismatch in speed. For example, communication traveling at the speed of light, while physical gold settlement still depends on ships and trains. The second row represents fidelity mismatch. This is dimensionality reduction. For example, trying to represent a complex, multivariable reality using a single numerical metric. The third row represents state incommensurability. This is a qualitative phase shift. An example would be attempting to fight inflation with traditional interest rate policy after the economy has fundamentally shifted into a state of fiscal dominance. These 3 forms of decoupling each represent different ways that systems lose alignment. Temporal mismatch. Temporal mismatch occurs when 2 interdependent systems operate at fundamentally different speeds. Within any feedback loop, the slower component determines the maximum stability of the entire system. Consider communication during the 19th century. Telegraph technology allowed information to travel almost instantaneously. Gold settlement, however, still depended upon physical transportation. The communication system accelerated dramatically. The settlement system did not. The resulting speed mismatch forced society to invent compensating mechanisms: correspondent banking, credit, settlement through financial promises rather than immediate transfer of physical gold. The financial system effectively abstracted settlement into debt in order to compensate for the growing speed gap. Fidelity mismatch. Fidelity mismatch arises from dimensionality reduction. Reality possesses many interacting dimensions. Measurement systems cannot observe everything. Instead, they compress reality into manageable indicators. As the real world becomes increasingly complex, the amount of information preserved within those indicators steadily declines. The mutual information shared between reality and the measurement gradually decays. Eventually, institutions begin optimizing the measurement rather than the underlying reality. This is the environment in which calibration drift develops. State incommensurability. State incommensurability represents something much deeper. This is not simply a lack of data, nor is it merely low-resolution measurement. Instead, the operational environment itself has fundamentally changed. Its primary variables no longer exist inside the controller's mental model. The institution continues applying familiar control levers. But because reality has shifted into an entirely different operating state, those same actions now produce the exact opposite of their intended outcome. The controller is no longer solving the wrong problem poorly. It is solving the wrong problem perfectly. Section 3. Case Study 1. Military Doctrine and Asymmetric Cost Exhaustion. The changing nature of modern warfare provides a clear demonstration of state incommensurability and compensating complexity. Imagine a diagram with two competing systems. The first is the legacy air defense architecture. A $2 million interceptor missile destroys a $20,000 drone. The capital exhaustion ratio is approximately 100 to 1. The second system is an asymmetric swarm strategy. Commercial assembly lines produce enormous numbers of inexpensive drones. Those drones saturate the defensive grid and steadily deplete the supply of expensive interceptors. The result is striking. The defender achieves tactical success. Every incoming drone is successfully destroyed, yet the defender simultaneously accelerates its own structural capital depletion. It wins every battle, while slowly losing the war. Mid-20th century military doctrine was designed for symmetrical warfare between peer states. Its architecture emphasized expensive platforms, stealth technology, high-fidelity radar, centralized command structures. Its defining variables included tonnage, unit cost, radar cross-section, payload capacity. Modern asymmetric warfare operates inside a completely different state space. Instead of competing through larger aircraft or more sophisticated bombers, distributed drone networks rely upon inexpensive commercial electronics, satellite navigation, autonomous coordination, and saturation swarm tactics. Traditional air superiority metrics become largely irrelevant. When a defender launches a $2 million guided interceptor to destroy a $20,000 autonomous drone, the weapon performs exactly as designed. The missile succeeds. The drone is destroyed. Tactically, everything works perfectly. Strategically, however, the situation has fundamentally changed. The battlefield is no longer being determined by platform superiority. It is being determined by cost asymmetry. Every successful interception consumes scarce, expensive capital. Meanwhile, the attacker replaces lost drones using inexpensive, mass-produced components. The defensive action therefore becomes a compensating mechanism. Each tactical victory contributes directly to long-term structural bankruptcy. This content is brought to you by Bobby Giggs. Promote your brand here and reach a wide audience across platforms like YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook. Follow the links in the description to get started. Section 4. Case Study 2. Monetary Architecture and Fiscal Dominance. Monetary policy under conditions of fiscal dominance provides another example of state incommensurability. Imagine another diagram. The central bank raises interest rates. Its intended objective is to reduce demand and suppress inflation, but the underlying economic environment has fundamentally changed. Government debt has become extremely large relative to national output. Higher interest rates therefore produce a different chain of events. Government interest expenses rise sharply. Budget deficits expand. Interest payments flow directly into the private economy. Instead of removing liquidity, the policy injects additional purchasing power into the system. The final result is paradoxical. The policy amplifies the very inflationary pressure it was designed to suppress. Historically, the Federal Reserve developed its inflation-fighting framework during an era dominated by demand-driven inflation. The assumption was straightforward: raise interest rates, reduce credit creation, lower consumer demand, bring inflation back under control. Under fiscal dominance, however, the underlying financial physics changes. When government debt reaches sufficiently high levels, interest expense itself becomes one of the primary drivers of fiscal deficits. Higher policy rates therefore produce larger government interest payments. Those payments become direct transfers into the private economy. Broad money distribution increases, inflationary pressure increases. The control mechanism has inverted. Similarly, if inflation is being caused by physical supply chain disruption, shipping bottlenecks, or maritime choke points, higher interest rates cannot manufacture additional oil. They cannot build container ships. They cannot reopen blocked trade routes. Instead, they increase the financing cost required to build the very infrastructure needed to resolve the shortage. The central bank continues pulling the same policy lever, but the machine connected to that lever has fundamentally changed. The controller believes it is executing one command. Reality executes the opposite. Section 5. The anatomy of systemic collapse. Coupled systems undergoing differential evolution tend to follow a predictable four-stage life cycle. Imagine a graph. The vertical axis represents overall system efficiency. The horizontal axis represents time. Initially, efficiency remains high. Then it gradually declines through four distinct phases. Phase 1 is structural alignment. Operational reality and the control architecture evolve together. Adaptation occurs quickly. Measurements remain faithful to reality. Most of the system's energy produces useful work. Phase 2 is friction and patching. Reality begins evolving faster than the controller. An alignment gap appears. The institution responds by introducing compensating mechanisms, administrative procedures, financial leverage, translation layers, operational workarounds. The system continues functioning, but overhead steadily increases. Phase 3 is overhead dominance. Compensating mechanisms begin growing nonlinearly. Eventually, the majority of available energy is consumed simply maintaining the patches. The useful work performed by the system steadily approaches zero. Mathematically, the thesis expresses this as follows. As time approaches the critical point, the ratio of useful energy to total energy approaches zero. At this stage, the institution becomes increasingly self-referential. It optimizes internal compliance, internal reporting, internal metrics, while steadily losing contact with operational reality. Phase 4 is forced bifurcation. The system reaches an energetic boundary. Maintaining the accumulated complexity is no longer possible. One of two outcomes follows. Either the system collapses entirely, or the accumulated compensating mechanisms are discarded. A new control architecture emerges, one that is once again aligned with the current operational environment. Section 6. Diagnostic Indicators and Predictive Framework. This framework proposes three measurable indicators for diagnosing structural decay. The first is the phase lag ratio. In plain English, this measures how quickly the controller adapts relative to the operational environment. If the controller requires years to adapt while reality changes in months, the ratio becomes extremely large. Such a system becomes increasingly unstable. One contemporary example is digital assets. Technology evolves continuously. Legal and regulatory systems often require years to respond. The adaptation gap becomes structurally unsustainable. The second indicator is the Compensating Complexity Index. This measures the amount of effort devoted to maintaining patches relative to performing the system's original purpose. As more resources are consumed by hedging, compliance, risk mitigation, financial engineering, and administrative overhead, the index rises. A rapidly increasing Compensating Complexity Index signals that structural exhaustion is approaching. The third indicator is mutual information decay. This measures how faithfully internal metrics continue representing external reality. As the relationship between measurements and reality weakens, institutions increasingly optimize proxy metrics instead of operational outcomes. When official indicators continue reporting success while real-world performance deteriorates, metric decoupling has become complete. Section 7. Conclusion. The principles of realignment. The fundamental mistake made by decaying institutions is attempting to solve structural misalignment through incremental acceleration. They push legacy controls harder, allocate larger budgets, collect increasingly detailed measurements. But all of those efforts occur along obsolete dimensions. Imagine one final diagram. The first path is labeled the obsolete path. Legacy controls lead to larger budgets. Larger budgets lead to higher resolution measurements. Those measurements continue observing an obsolete model. The result is accelerated collapse through increasing overhead. The second path is labeled the realignment path. The first step is recognizing state incommensurability. The second step is removing accumulated compensating mechanisms. The third step is deploying a new architecture natively aligned with operational reality. The central lesson is simple. You cannot solve a structural speed mismatch through physical acceleration. You must change the state of the asset or the system itself. Just as physical gold settlement ultimately required native digital bearer assets to synchronize with light-speed communication networks. Legacy military, economic, and institutional architectures must eventually discard accumulated compensating mechanisms and realign themselves with the operational realities they exist to govern. Systemic stability is not preserved by defending obsolete models. It is preserved by recognizing when an architecture has reached the end of its useful life, removing the accumulated complexity, and restoring alignment between the control system and reality itself.